So why is this Copenhagen conference so important? Well, there are two reasons. And the first is that the latest science is saying that climate change is happening much faster than even 2 or 3 years ago scientists were predicting. Principally, the ice sheets of the Arctic and Antarctic are melting very rapidly, with consequent implications for temperature rises and sea level rise. And the second reason is more complex, that we're currently in just the first commitment period from 2008 to 2012 of the Kyoto Protocol that was negotiated and finally came into force only a few years ago. So what needs to be decided in Copenhagen should be the targets, the emissions reduction targets for the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol from 2013. Why does it have to be agreed in 2009? Because all the governments that signed it have to ratify it, and that takes quite a long time. But the additional problem, of course, is that US didn't sign Kyoto, so there has to be another parallel process that brings in the US and also the larger emitting nations, which also have no obligations under the Kyoto Protocol to cut their emissions. And that is why it's so complex and why it was so important to get an agreement in Copenhagen. So what are our hopes for Copenhagen? Well, up till a year ago, we really had quite high hopes that a really strong and legally binding treaty could be the outcome. Both politicians and those who are organising this conference, the Danish government and the UNFCCC Secretariat, are now saying this is just not feasible. There hasn't been enough progress made in the negotiations that have already happened in the 8 weeks already this year to make that feasible. And also there are particular political problems around the US committing to a firm target. So our hopes are that some strong outcome will be possible that will commit nations to negotiating a legal treaty within the coming months, so sometime during 2010. What are our fears? I think one of the worst fears is that a weak agreement will be an outcome which governments will trumpet as a good agreement. So we'll have targets that will not stem climate change. We'll have funding that nowhere addresses adequately adaptation. And we will have an extremely discontented bunch of developing countries who are, after all, the majority of the countries, gravely distrusting all international processes. It would be better, we think, as NGOs in general, to have no deal now with commensurate pressure on governments to come to a deal next year.
The Copenhagen conference, which is going to be held in the coming weeks, is an opportunity for the developed countries in order to make decisions to help the developing countries for the adaptation. And also that is also their historical responsibilities and their moral responsibilities, because the current climate change, the science has proved that it is because of the human activities and because of the greenhouse gas emitted by the developed countries in last century. So there is a moral responsibilities by the developed countries to help the developing countries, the poor people or the most vulnerable people, to adapt to the climate change by supporting them through finance, through technologies, and to their capacity development. And at the same time, the vulnerable countries are also expecting these kinds of decisions coming from the developed countries in the Copenhagen conference.
I think when it comes to the issue of the Copenhagen, workshop or conference, from the Southern Africa perspective, we are actually realizing the impact of climate change, particularly when it comes to frequencies of droughts and even floods being topped off, and how poor people are affected in terms of their basic livelihoods. So in my view, it would be good that countries as well as international organizations take a positive stand in terms of concrete actions that would be taken, from now onwards in terms of trying to address, this challenge. One of the things that, I've just come across recently is that schools, for example, I was talking to, my son who is doing geography at A level, and he was talking about, a project that they've come up with that try to create an awareness within their environment about climate change and its effects, and what they could even do at micro school level, which would probably extend to a number of other schools, probably within a province or within a particular region, and probably it can be a national or regional impact in some of those initiatives. So I think that level of awareness is very, very important, and taking concrete actions is very critical. I think poor mitigation measures is a very critical thing, because as we notice, the world is actually becoming poorer, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots is getting wider and wider. And part of the reason is really because of some of the impacts of climate change. So I would really want us to look at things that really address the less disadvantaged communities, the poorer communities, and we have got programs that will try and address. And this should not be excluding the communities themselves that have been involved, but also trying to adopt some of the local knowledges that do exist to try and mitigate against climate change effects.